Hi, everyone. This is Mukundar Raghavan with the Mirror Media Podcast. And today we have Dr. Amit Majmudar, who is a physician, but he's also a poet laureate of your state, I believe, correct? In Ohio.
Former poet laureate, yeah, back
Yeah,
in the
yeah, former poet laureate of Ohio. And he's also been writing in the past few years, which I have myself, his translation of the Gita called God's Song. And then he's working on a Mahabharata translation, basically the taking the book
retelling, yeah,
retelling right into three
yeah,
books as opposed to
right,
the 18 original. So,
right.
Amit, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me. Thrilled to be on here.
So Amit, I first got notice of you on Twitter a few years ago. You post pretty actively, but not um, I think not necessarily always political stuff. It's much more connected to the poetry, to history, like literature, and then sometimes we have issues in the diaspora community that we have discussions around. But I started following you a few years ago, and then on top of that, I saw your engagement with Vishal on like kind of like Indian and Greek kind of
Yeah.
interplay a while back, and I thought that was really fascinating. I thought it was a good conversation, and it was, and I sometimes think in the spaces in the diasporic spaces and the Desi spaces, there's a very strong influence. I mean, engagement with our traditions, of course, without but there seems to be not as much deep understanding and engagement around the Indo-European and other traditions that are connecting to our traditions. So
Mhm.
before we get into that, like, what's your background? Like, how did you get into this, and like, what was your childhood like? This is pretty
Oh
broad,
yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah.
So I grew up in Ohio, suburban Cleveland, and both my parents are doctors, and my sister kind of went into an accelerated medical program. So everything in the house was just medicine. Um, and I kind of just went into that as my career as well. But that was almost like just the thing that you did to have a job, kind of,
Right.
in my family. And so the real life of the mind took off very early. I used to read a lot of like mysteries and spy novels and things like that when I was like very young. But then, one thing led to another, and I kind of got bored with that stuff. And then I started just looking into other deeper stuff. And then that was kind of like just where I found, it spoke to me, right? So
Right.
I remember 13, 14, 15 years old, I was reading, Upanishads in translation. I was reading Dante and some of the old Latin poets and Greek poets and everything in translation. And I just kind of took off in that direction and I never looked back. And so if you think about it, at this point, it's a few decades of just kind of relentlessly reading all this stuff all the time. And I don't do too many other things. I do the obviously I have my career as a physician and I
Right.
have my family, but other than
The
those
career on the
two,
side.
like, I don't let the time go by. I don't do things that drain time very much. So, I don't watch like sports. I don't drink. I don't go out and drinking or anything like that. Never done that. I barely watch movies, or anything because those are just big chunks of time that I could spend reading or writing. So
Right.
so I think it's kind of like how did I get into it? I don't know. I just kind of stumbled into it. It was just kind of like my thing. Like I was just into it. Maybe it had to do with the fact that my parents wouldn't buy me a Nintendo 64 back in the day. I could have gone into the gaming route, but I couldn't do that. So I had a library card, and library books were free. So I just got a ton of those for years. And
Did you
so
grow up playing sports too, or anything like that?
I actually played a little bit of tennis, but I didn't formally play too many sports. I work out almost every day,
Yeah.
just to stay healthy and all that, and just for longevity and whatnot. But no, I didn't play sports other than tennis very much.
So like your engagement with, I guess, the at least the Hindu Sanskrit world is really through literature. It was, but or was it also spiritual at any level?
No, well, no, it's definitely spiritual, and I don't really distinguish between literary and spiritual. I think that's
Sure.
the crucial element. For me, translating the Gita was very much a spiritual exercise. It required dhyan, it required tapas, it required um, everything, and it required humility also, right? Because
Right.
it's not you're subordinating yourself to something else, to the text, and you're basically um, your will is suppressed and you are in the service. It's almost seva, right?
Right.
It's in service of this ancient text that you have a position of that at least I feel that I have a position of humility towards and gratefulness towards, and all those things are spiritual to me. And
Right.
also, even if you look at my original work in poetry, that too, to gain a mastery to whatever degree of the English verse line, to get a handle on alliteration, assonance, meter, rhyme, metaphor, imagery, all of those elements of poetry that take years to get control over.
Right.
um, all of that, it's very analogous to spiritual discipline that takes years, to yogic discipline that takes years to attain mastery and to attain self mastery. And I think that mastering language to whatever degree is similar to Hindu notions of self mastery.
But you know it's interesting that way because like right within the Indian traditions themselves, right? Something like Vyakarana or
Mhm.
Mimamsa or even the the science of etymology, Nigantu and all these other things that play a role. I mean Nirukta, they're actually disciplines, right? To
Right.
learn the chandas and the or the meter and how to chant this properly, where to break the sandhis. It's treated as a spiritual discipline. And you
Right, and,
know,
and they're treated as sacred. In fact,
right.
in meters are sacred, right? The
Right.
meters are sacred.
Gayatri,
Yeah, yeah, and Brutsaman and all these things,
yeah,
and even in the Gita, one of the things, Krishna says
yeah,
of the, this I am that,
yeah,
he his individual excellences. He picks a meter. He picks a meter that I have the meters I am Gayatri or whatever,
yeah,
like
yeah.
that. So meter itself is considered one of the excellences or one of the splendors of creation.
Right. It's just like
And I
Vedanam
think
Samavedosmi, right?
right,
Where
right,
amongst the Vedas I'm the Samaveda, the one that's
right,
sung and done in a
right,
certain, way. It's
right.
yeah, absolutely. So I mean, in that sense, so I mean, I understand that aspect of this. I mean, I'm assuming in your childhood, you indicated earlier you're of Gujarati descent, right? So
Mhm.
was your family deeply intertwined and engaged in the Gujarati diaspora community in your area, or was it kind of like for example myself, like in some sense my father he's Kannada, but there was all these other people around us, so we kind of didn't
Yeah,
just do one thing. So I don't
right.
know how you guys
Yeah,
felt.
for us, I think our family, we did have, the Gujarati Samaj and, other Gujaratis in the area. Cleveland probably has more Indians than you would imagine. This is back
Right.
in the 80s or 90s. It probably has more than people would imagine. People would think that Ohio has nothing, but in reality, there's a fairly sizable Indian community, Gujarati community. There wasn't too much in the way of religion, spirituality, literature, or any of that in the house. Obviously, we were, highly educated family, but it was more STEM oriented type of
Right.
stuff. So the books around the house, either they were my books that I got from the library, but all the other books in the house were, physician's desk reference and books, internal medicine textbooks and things like that. Those were the only books in the house. We didn't have like a home library. All that was just me, and
Right.
I'm the only one in the family who's kind of obsessed with that. It's very anomalous, but yeah, so yeah, we did have that. We didn't have very much of a religious bent, I think, and most of the families there did not. I think that you know I, deracination was definitely something that I witnessed there, and I think that it was partly an apprehension about that probably to some extent compelled me toward the tradition. And I think that in in the when I look at the long term or long run element of it, I think that even then I felt I felt more drawn to the Hindu tradition than I do to the Indian culture of the contemporary India.
Right.
And that's not a distinction that is v very present to people's minds. I think people conflate the two a lot. But from a nationality standpoint or even a cultural standpoint, I feel very American.
Yeah.
And I've never been anything other than an American. I've born and raised in this country, and it really hits me hard when I go to India, right?
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, I feel extremely grounded and grateful and in love with the Hindu tradition, which again is not synonymous with contemporary India.
Sure, sure. So in that regard, like, do you know what did you, I mean, you as you indicated, your family wasn't like necessarily religious, spiritual.
Mhm.
But do you know if you belong to a certain tradition? Were you like a lot of
Oh yeah,
Gujaratis are Trinachi or whatnot?
oh
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no, we did have that element. We were a Brahmin family, no alcohol, no smoking, none of that in the house,
yeah,
and probably maybe by other people's standards, we probably were more religious than not. Who knows?
right.
I do have we do have a really interesting history as far as that's concerned.
Yeah,
Uh, I don't know if you've heard of Narsi Mehta,
of
the
course, yeah.
the Gujarati saint
Vaishnava
poet,
Janata, yeah.
right? Vaishnav Janto and all a bunch of other ones.
Right, right.
Uh, so I'm his descendant in a certain sense, not his descendant, but technically his brother's descendant.
Okay.
Um, and basically, Narsi Mehta, originally our jati or was Nagar, is a Brahmin subcaste that was originally Shaivite and Narsi Mehta had a vision in which Shiva himself took him into the forest to show him the Krishna Lila.
Yeah,
And accordingly, he sort of, went into Vaishnava Bhakti, right?
right.
And he brought the whole family with him. And so all of his relatives and descendants ever since have been Vaishnavas. So we are we're not necessarily unique among our subcaste, but we are more Nagars are Shaivite usually. We are Vaishnavs, relate because of Narsimeta, and I think our Ishtadev is Ranchodrai.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Krishna when he fled the battlefield.
Jarasandha, yeah.
Right. Basically, that was his. It's kind of like metaphorically or not metaphorically, the meaning of it is kind of like he had no pride in that issue. He knew that it was the
Right,
right thing to do. And even though in that era and in that culture, fleeing the battlefield would be
right.
shameful, he was like, this is the right thing to do, not necessarily the socially, whatever thing to do. And that's very much Krishna's philosophy throughout the Mahabharata, because there's a lot of times where he's telling the Pandavas to break the code in the service of a higher goal, you
Yeah,
know?
absolutely. I want to get into that. I think there's a lot to play with that, but I kind of want to go still through your background because I think
Yeah.
it's very telling because you talked about Deracination and similarly, like I grew up in Southern California. I probably a bit unlike yours. I'm a pretty religious family. My dad, like we are also a Brahmana, but my dad was also one sec. Sorry. Uh, okay. So yeah, I mean, like I grew up here in the U.S. too, in Southern California, and one of the concerns that popped up in my life was, I grew up in a pretty decently religious family. My father belongs to he's a Kannada, but he's also Sri Vaishnava Iyengar Brahmin. My mom is too, but she's Tamil. But our family wasn't necessarily like very traditional. Like we have people that married Muslims, people that married people in Japan, other like other jatis varna. So with like while there was a sense of like we were Brahmin, I had no clue who anybody else was. Like everyone
Right.
else to me in my world is just like either Brahmin or everyone, or my dad would say something to the extent of, "Oh, it's this stuff doesn't matter as much, right? Like,
Right.
just like treat people well and all that." Um,
Yeah.
but what I noticed in our community is like this over time is the focus, like you said, is on comes on Indian culture and
Hmm.
not like the Hindu religion or the stories, except for like maybe dance and music where you have some exposure to it, but it's just like it's kind of like bottled off and sequestered from like everything else. And when you brought up deracination, it's interesting to me because like I struggled with that in high school big time. Because I used to go to school with the tilak, and I used to have to rub it off. I rub it off in high school
Yeah.
because like I do prayers in the morning, go to school, but then everyone would be like, "Is your forehead bleeding?" And ask
Yeah,
some
yeah, yeah. You were
stupid questions.
super religious. You were not kidding around, man.
Well, I wasn't like I just did what my parents told me. It's
Okay,
like
yeah.
so I learned these things. I wasn't like into it, and I read the Gita when I was the first time I read the actual Gita was when I was like 17. So
Yeah.
like I didn't read any of the text until I read like Amachitra Kathas, like these,
Yeah,
the.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I do what my parents did. I was a good first child,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so but going to school, you rub it off. But then and then and then there was a period of a few years where I did what my parents wanted at home, but outside the house, I was like, no, screw this culture. I don't care. You want to be
Mm.
American, right? Like this
Right, right,
desire.
right.
And then I got back into it probably beginning in college. But what I noticed is like a lot of people in that deracination process, they just continue with it. Like I somehow went back into trying to figure out what's my culture, what's my tradition, what's like especially because I went to Catholic school. You get a lot of comments about like is can you eat can you eat meat? Can you eat this? You worship a monkey
Get that in
god.
public school too. It's not
Yeah,
just
yeah,
Catholic school.
yeah,
I went to a public school. You still get it. Yeah, you get
yeah.
that.
You
Yeah.
get all that stuff, right? So like, um, and just trying to figure out like what's the logical basis. Is my religion really this like quote unquote primitive? Even though I hate that term, but let's
Yeah.
just use that. And it's trying to figure out what that was. And I think
Yeah.
like how did you like because you said you addressed deracination. What was your deracination issue that you're trying to
Oh,
get around?
I think first of all, I think that a lot of these things they relate to past life momentum.
Yeah,
And it's almost like you can struggle against it, but you're going to find your way to whatever it is whatever your trajectory is, whatever your past lives have hurled you toward,
right,
you're going to find your way to that eventually. And so, no matter what the external environment is, eventually you push against it, right? Eventually you push against it for whatever reason. And so, um, I think in my case, there was a lot of early on in your life, maybe you're not necessarily examining it too much. I used to eat meat, I used to eat steak. It
right,
wasn't even a thing. It was just like, oh yeah, I'll try that, whatever. And I didn't really think too much about it. And then as far as the religion was concerned, I should mention that when I was in second grade, my family, like my dad and mom, tried to relocate us to India. So I actually did 2 years of elementary school in
oh wow,
India. I did second grade and third grade in India. We just, I grew up, born and brought up in America. Then we just plucked me down, put me in Ahmedabad, India, Gujarat.
yeah,
And I went to an English medium school, but I did 2 years there. And that kind of like gave me I mean, I got Gujarati and Hindi out of it, so I can speak those now. I've never lost that. And it gave me like a lot of insight into India and a lot of exposure to India
right,
and a lot of diarrhea. And then we came right back. We came right back to the same part of Ohio, same part of Cleveland, and I just resumed um,
your life,
in
yeah,
fourth grade in the same exact classmates and everything. And it was like I write about it in Black Avatar. There's that book Black Avatar, which I think you'd be very interested. You'd find interesting. I write all about it in there, and basically that was a dislocation, which at the time was kind of like unpleasant in some ways,
sure,
as you can imagine. Um, but it was very formative, and I'm very grateful that that happened because it kept me from feeling completely at home in America or American culture. Okay. Um, did I ever feel completely at home in Indian culture? No, not at all.
Yeah.
But do I, or did I ever feel completely at home in American culture? Not after that experience. All of a sudden, I knew that there was something different. There's something else, something else. And that touch of estrangement was very crucial in my development, you know? And that being able to like speak the language, having watched like the Mahabharata serial
Yeah.
on television on Doordarshan,
Oh,
um,
wow.
all of those are formative experiences that 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 altered me from a trajectory that I could have very easily taken. Okay,
Right.
I think that if my parents had not plucked me out and dropped me into this environment and then dropped me back, if they'd kept me in India, I would not ever become a writer. I would have had to just study, 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 and memorize all this stuff all day, and just do my studies or whatever. Because you know, rote memorization is everything there
Right.
in that school system. And a lot of my formative intellectual work as a writer occurred in high school because in American high schools you can do other stuff. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? It's not your whole and soul of your life. Oh, your 10th grade SSC or whatever you have to study for. No, it's not like that. Which is a wonderful thing. I think it's a wonderful thing. Um, so I think that was a crucial element of my formative years, so that when I would witness other people deracinating,
Hmm.
and would feel that tendency in myself, there was always a part of me that was like, wait, there's something else, there's something out there, something in the past or in my ancestry that I'm interested in, that I want to know more about. And so even as I was doing all those things like, eating pepperoni pizza and steak and doing all those non-Hindu type stuff, I was simultaneously reading the Upanishads. I was
Right.
simultaneously reading Kalidasa and all this stuff. So there was a dual track thing, right? And then the past life energy comes in, right? And the past life energy, I think for me, ended up being me marrying my wife. So we got married super early,
Hmm.
and we just and she's like, she grew up in the Bay Area. Her grandparents were in the house. There's a ton of Indians there, a ton of Hindus there. She was part of the Swadhyay Parivar, super duper based Hindu everything, right? And
Yeah.
that element of her really appealed to me and spoke to my soul. And so after joining my life to hers, um, over time, she has kind of drawn me more into this world, or into the past, or into the ancestry, into the religion. And I think she's been a very formative person for me too. Whether it's and it's not as though, I think part of it was that in the closed environment of our marriage, I had sort of permission to go deep into the religion side of it, which if I'd married someone who was not Hindu,
Right.
or married someone who was not religious, there would have been a natural tendency to match that person's energy and not necessarily get into it that deeply. But because she's so into it, I'm so into it. You know what I'm saying? Like, she
Yeah.
has more verses of the Gita memorized than I do, right?
Right.
And so I married somebody who's super into that stuff, and that gave me permission to pursue my past life energy to the fullest.
That's really interesting. I mean, that's really, really, I think it's beautiful in many ways. Like,
It is
but you also
beautiful, and
understand.
it's the best decision I've ever made. I gotta tell you,
But like how you
God's
also
song
connect.
wouldn't have been written if I had not married her. I'm pretty sure God's song would not have been written. I'm pretty sure.
Interesting. But she's
Yeah.
also author herself, right? She
He is.
writes.
He is.
Yeah. But hers are more like YA kind of books,
She wrote
correct?
she published a YA novel, and she's working on some children's books that are going to find their way into print in a little bit. So, yeah, and she also does like, she does storytelling and stuff
Yeah.
like that on Instagram and everything. So, that's more, she's a teacher, and she's also teaches classical dance, Bharatanatyam,
Okay.
and so she's very much a teacher. Has a very teacherly kind of, she loves to share it with kids and younger people. So
Yeah. That's awesome. That's great. I think part of my thing is my journey's a bit more I think non-linear than yours in that sense, right? I, like I grew up, I did not eat a single ounce of meat until probably 30. Um, and then, now I once in a while eat it. But I still avoid, I've never had steak or beef
Right.
or anything like that. But that was
Yeah.
like my one taboo I couldn't get past.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I do drink. So that's something like, I have those issues that I don't know if I care to get rid of necessarily. And like part of this
Yeah, I
is
mean, it's not like some. I doubt that it's some. The gods are being like, "What is he doing?" I
no, I
doubt,
don't.
I doubt that. You know what I'm saying? But
Yeah,
it's just not. It's not for me. But
yeah,
each their own. Yeah.
correct. I mean, like I still find at some level there's you know especially if you buy into this karma deeply, and which I do, I think it's absolutely true because it's just simply cause and effect. I think
Right.
there's gonna be repercussions for me, but I'm content with dealing with that at that level,
Yeah.
right? So it's my journey in that sense is like I've also like even though I came from this like semi-traditional family, I've been married before, got divorced, I'm married again, I have stepchildren, and I have a very unique life, but like the the texts behind me are the ones that have like grounded me through it all, right? Like
Mhm.
Mahabharata, Upanishads,
Right.
the Gita, the Pancharatra traditions, the
Mhm.
Shaiva Siddhantas, all that stuff. Just learning and understanding that process. So when did you like start? Like you were reading the translations. When did you start learning Sanskrit, and how did you get into that?
So I learned this. I learned Sanskrit to whatever extent I did. This is 10, 15, 10,
Yeah,
12 years ago, just to translate the Gita. And I went just word by word through the whole thing. I studied the etymologies of the words, got into the Proto-Indo-European roots
right.
of it, and it was very much Gita centric.
Mm,
It was a Gita centered study of the language, and I did that because um, you know, I do feel that the Proto-Indo-European roots of the Sanskrit words and then the ways in which they can be traced into Greek, Latin, and then from there into English.
right.
I feel like that is crucial to the translator's art, you know? It's crucial to the translator's art. It helped me a lot as far as word choice is concerned.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, and really, it was very much the will to translate the Gita that took me into that language. Am I fluent in it? Nah, I'm not fluent in it. I mean, it's a difficult language. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a difficult language, and you don't have the immersion that you have with Gujarati and Hindi.
right.
So Gujarati and Hindi, I can just speak, and I'm not the quickest reader, but I can parse it out, whatever. I can just do that. But with Sanskrit, it's a difficult language, and I don't have too many. You can't really, you can't watch like a lot of the Hindi that I know is just watching
Movies.
shows, watching
Yeah,
movies. You can
yeah.
pick it up that way. And obviously, I can't write poetry in it, but I can follow everything, and waiters in India are like, "Ah, bolte hain?" I mean, like they're like surprised that I can. They look at me, they think I'm just like a typical like American tourist guy, but then I bust out the Hindi or whatever, and they're kind of they love it. But yeah, and so that's how I got into it, and really I distinctly remember being like in my first year of college and like reading a translation of the Gita, and you've probably read multiple translations of the Gita.
Yeah,
A lot of them are just god awful. They're
yeah,
god awful. They sound like prose treatises that are just even worse than prose treatises. They sound like they're not even English. And I was reading one of them, and I was looking at it, and I was like, I've heard this in the original Sanskrit getting sung. I've
yeah,
heard it being sung. And how can they take something that's so musical and has so much alliteration and assonance in it and has this clear metrical structure to it? How can they take that and turn it into this? This is like a transgression against the original. And I remember sitting on my dorm room bed in like my first year of college reading that, and I was like, somebody needs to do this justice in some way. Some poet needs to get in on this And I thought, maybe that'll be me someday. Maybe I'll do that someday. And that was one of the things. I mean, like the other time I remember doing that was when I was like about 15 years old, and I remember seeing the Borzoi insignia on an Alfred A. Knopf book,
Yeah.
and I was like, I want to be published by Alfred A. Knopf one day. I want that Borzoi on one of my books, and that happened too. So I manifested that. It's really weird.
The secret.
I manifested it. I was literally just like, I want that. I'm going to have that one day,
Yeah.
and then, but boom, it
Yeah.
happened, and it's kind of crazy that should happen, that it should manifest like that, but it did.
Yeah, that's what when I was reading through God's song, the one of the flavors I got was you you tried to make poetry of the translation itself, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so there was like a flow to it that was much easier, I think, than but other translations. And I think
But
it's a
it's
good,
extremely accurate. I think if you look at the Sanskrit and you
yeah,
go right to my shlokas, there are times where you will see me replicating the anaphora, or the repetitive structure of the lines.
right,
There'll be times where you see me repeating the sequence of phrases in which Krishna builds an image. You know,
right,
you can trace it one to one. There are times where I replicate assonance and replicate alliteration.
right,
So
right,
I was very careful about making it as accurate as possible. There was no, I can't think of a single instance where I was like, I'm gonna do a little poetic license with this to make it sound a
right, right,
certain. Yeah.
right,
So it is. I tried to make it a poem, but it's like hyper accurate. It's like
right.
like meticulously accurate is an important point.
Right, right, right. No, which is, which I got, I've read about half of it, which I've got from it so far. I would have, I think the thing is like sometimes, and you try to give a glossary in the beginning of like the names and things like that, and I think it's so hard to think about how to get, because the Gita is it's a smaller book, but it's massive. Like I don't know how to like when you talk about like characters like the name like Godak Geisha, like the meaning
Yeah.
of that name, like
Yeah.
what tries to like pull out. Yeah, it means conqueror of sleep, but it also means like one with beautiful hair.
Yeah.
And but what does it mean to conquer sleep, and why is that connected? And those things
How
like
does that connect to his hair, right? It's
right
like, yeah.
and
The thing is, a lot of things. I think sometimes, and this is the case with Homeric poetry as well.
right
Um, there are terms that are used for their metrical value.
yeah
And I think that a lot of times, so we've forgotten that in the contemporary world because um, people don't write in meter anymore. But in the old days, you had to fill out the meter. And so whenever you hear the term eva cha
yeah
in a shlok, that's the Gita poet basically filling out the meter.
right
And Gurakesha, Rishikesha, Paramtapa,
yeah
all those words, those are used for the meter in a lot of cases,
of
and they don't
course
necessarily have a direct or meaningful role in the shloka. And that was something that was a decision I did make. In that sense, sometimes I use the term or like the name instead of the epithet, because the epithet, besides being distracting, it's also irrelevant. You know what I'm
right
saying? Having said that, uh, the Gita, the God song itself is translation and commentary, but the commentary is very very streamlined.
right
It's very very, here are the highlights, and there's a little summary of what the adhyaya is about, and then there's a sort of a quote unquote listener's guide where I basically talk about the main elements of it. And I can tell you that the Gita is so huge. There, I plan to do this. I plan to do an 18 volume commentary on it. All right. I fully plan to do that. I got some other projects that I need to clear my docket for. But at some point, maybe 10 years from now, or who knows when the spirit moves me, right? I'm
yeah
going to go through that entire book, the entire Gita, and I'm going to do one book per adhyay of commentary, because at this point, like, I've gotten so much into the nuts and bolts of it that there's going to be elements of the commentary related to the verses, like the verse craft itself, which you never find anywhere. and then I want to do it in a comparative religion sort of way because I do believe that there is there are contrasts between the Hindu dharma and the other major world religions
Sure.
that are insufficiently emphasized by gurus and swamis and this and that because they do not study other religions. They're kind of just grounded in their own parampara, their own tradition. They have not gone into the nitty gritty of other religions, which is one of the things that I study a lot of are other religions other than Hinduism.
Right, right.
And I've been doing that for a quarter of a century now. And it wasn't because I was like a seeker, like, hey, I don't know what's right or wrong. I want to see what other.
Hmm.
I wanted to know what makes them tick.
Hmm.
I want to know what they talk about when we're not listening. I want to know the mechanisms of their success. You know what I'm saying? So that's something that's another thing that I can bring to the commentary that I don't think too many other people ever have.
You know what's interesting? So, like, on your first point, where we're talking about the, 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 the
Oh, you're cutting out. You're cutting out. Yeah, the microphone's not working.
oh, hold on one sec.
Oh, there. Now it's working. Now it's working.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, when we're going back to the, like, let's say the the epithets of the characters, right? Like, I think, yeah, I do agree with you. I think there's parts of the text where it's filler. Like,
Not
but
always. Not always.
right,
Yeah.
like I think a key area where it's not is, like, for example, in chapter 11 when Krishna does the Vishwarupam, he goes, kalas vilokache pravrto lokas pravrta, and he goes, and he ends with basically saying, nimittamatam bhava savyasachin, right? So in that term, the savyasachin does a lot of the heavy lifting of the
Mhm.
term nimittamatam, right? Like the nimitta, become my instrument, like you, Arjuna, use your arms as
Right.
instrument, right? So this idea of Arjuna's ambidexterity, which is
Yeah.
uniquely amongst the warriors in the
Right.
Kurukshetra, is
Right.
such a defining characteristic of him, where he's the same way that he uses his arms. He's saying, Krishna said, become my arms in this
Right. Yeah.
battle, right?
Yeah. That's a
So,
good one. Yeah. Right.
so many times it's like, so I don't know if you've had opportunity to read the commentaries on the Gita by Ramanuja, Shankara,
Mhm.
Madhva, or any of these people. So you'll find some of that in their commentarial traditions where they do get into the lyrical and the poetic nature of this, because they study poetics. And
Yeah.
then they'll also get into the theology and
Right.
like the
Yeah.
understanding of that. I don't
Yeah.
know if you
Yeah.
had a chance to read those
I
commentaries.
haven't read Madhava's. No. No.
Yeah, Madhwas is very interesting too, because he also does, he has his commentary on the Mahabharata, where he also kind of parses it out, connecting it to. I mean, and sometimes it feels almost like he's theorizing Hindu thought, like the way people theorize Indo-European, like
Mm.
the motifs, the mythic motifs. So the
Mhm.
motifs he'll take the motifs and play it through the entire text. It's actually really cool.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But it's usually Vaishnavite motifs through everything, like how Rudra is connected to Vishnu this way, this way. So he plays
Oh,
all this. Yeah. It's cool
yeah.
stuff. But yeah, so like, like for me, I learned Sanskrit in college. I learned a little bit with my dad, but most of it was through college. And I'm not like a super expert. I can pick up a text and decently read it. I'll need
Mhm.
a dictionary because, like, the problem with
Yeah, I
Sanskrit is,
definitely need a dictionary,
yeah,
especially if you're going into some of the Kavya. All right,
yeah.
so like Kalidas and everything. A lot of times, so the Gita has actually a very limited vocabulary.
Oh, very limited. Yeah.
As soon as I mean, they reuse so many words. It's a very very limited vocabulary. But if you go into Kalidasa and some of these other poets, they're using words that like you're not gonna just know. You know what I'm
No.
saying? It's not you got to find out what that word is, it's because the different birds and different this and that, you know what I'm saying, like
It's not even it's that, plus the fact that for like a word like a daughter, there's like 17 different words they use,
right,
and you're like,
right,
oh, how does this connect? And then you have to go look at like the etymologies and how they.
right.
It gets really complex, and you
Well,
definitely.
they have in late Sanskrit poetry apparently, and obviously I've not delved into this in a direct way, but I've read about it, which is that they would have poems that would literally mean two or three different things
Oh yeah.
based on the various meanings of the words, and they play them off each other
Oh
so
yeah.
that this line would mean this, and then it would have a completely different meaning, and then a completely different meaning, and all three of those meanings would be simultaneous for the entire shloka. It's I can't even imagine what that's like because there's no way to do that in English, but like hats off to them.
Dude, you're not even like I'm not like a expert in poetics, so like I read this one poem that the entire poem is like maybe this long, but it's only using the.
Oh,
It's just
wow.
it's just the word the, and where you break the creates the entire poem.
Oh,
It's
wow.
it's like da 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 da, and then you're
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
but for someone reading it's like nonsensical. But if you know Sanskrit, you know, oh, you break it here, this is what it
Oh,
means.
interesting.
And then there's
Interesting.
another poem written called I forget Raghava something, where you read it forwards, it's Rama's story, and then read it
Oh,
backwards, it's Krishna's.
oh, that's crazy. That is so
Yeah.
crazy. Oh, I never heard of
Yeah,
that.
it's written. I think it was probably in the 16th century, some 15th
Yeah,
century.
a lot of that was later,
Yeah,
later in the tradition. And you see that happening even in the English tradition where a certain ludic or sort of word game type of spirit takes over
yeah,
late when a language has undergone a high level of development and it's sort of at the tail end of something or of a culture that does tend to happen and it's not necessarily a healthy sign it's a sign that it's been taken over by bloodless scholars unfortunately
yeah.
you
I mean, so part of that is I think that's true, even in the Indian sense. I mean, the Hindu sense, because Sanskrit, you know, it's a unique language insofar that the Paninian rules, especially after Panini and the past like 2,500 years, it's a pretty fixed system. There's
right
not much variation that occurs anymore.
that's
I
why
mean,
they call it perfected right I think
right.
that's why it's perfected yeah
Right. So like, you know, and the idea is like from any single dhatu, any root, you can build an entire new vocabulary system off of, right? So it's pretty
Mhm.
cool. But it also has caused, I would I think probably after 10th, 11th century, kind of this fructification of the way poetry is done. It just becomes kind of like check marked. Oh, I done this, as opposed to
Right, right, and I think that directly relates. So late Latin poetry is similar in that
yeah,
regard. When it ceases to be a living language, it becomes the province of, like I said, bloodless scholars, basically. And
correct.
even in antiquity, um, and you see this in Sanskrit plays where some of it's in Sanskrit and the rest, like
Prakrit.
there's vernacular
Yeah,
mixed in it. And I think that even then, so something like Panini, something like here's your system and it's fixed, right? That in itself is a sign of lateness in the evolution of a language. And it languages that are young are not formalized in that sense. So they become formalized late. And I think that Sanskrit is really, really old and to the point where someone as ancient as that grammarian is actually late in the overall history or arc of Sanskrit. And it's kind of analogous to how like Plato went to the Egyptians to study and the Egyptians were like we're at the tail end of civilization. This is the late we're 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 at the late, twilight or dusk of
yeah,
civilization. Whereas we think of Plato as being like the dawn of Western civilization,
right.
at the very early elements of it. But Egypt and India are just extremely old. They're just extremely old. And
Yeah,
so Sanskrit has been not necessarily a dead language, but a finished language for quite some time. And that's why even in a period when a lot of Hindus think everyone was going around speaking Sanskrit,
yeah,
in reality, a certain class could speak Sanskrit, but vernaculars were everywhere, just as there was ecclesiastical Latin in say 16th century Europe, but
Right.
then everyone else was just speaking other languages.
No, it's interesting because like Parani or Patanjali himself talks about in his Mahabharata,
Hmm.
Parani's, that um, he makes somewhat fun of the Sanskrit that regular people speak. You know,
Hmm.
because
Because it's corrupt. It's upper branch,
yeah,
right?
yeah, right. And so, instead of saying hasta biao, they might say hasta biam, versus so like instead of saying two hands, you're saying hands, and they're like,
Yeah.
oh, well, you have two hands, you should be using the dual form, not the
Dual.
plural
Yeah.
form,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, and that's where it's like you find people do. I'm sure people spoke some form of vernacular Sanskrit, but
Right, but that's
yeah,
see, but as you just pointed
like a
out,
vulgar Latin,
those are departing from the various rules.
right?
But that's what languages do. It's just linguistic drift, you know,
Right, exactly.
linguistic drift, and you can't stop it.
No,
You can stop it only within the formal rules of a given language, which is then preserved by almost inevitably scholars. But
correct.
a living language is
No,
a changing language,
right.
and that holds true of English today as well.
Right, and absolutely
Every
true. Which is
language,
why you got
every
like,
language. Yeah.
High Latin, Vulgar Latin,
Right.
like the Latin of the church that you speak in Mass or preserved is
Right.
a higher Latin. It's not a Vulgar
Right. Right.
Latin. It's very interesting. I mean, once you start getting into like these linguistic areas, and you stop having these views of like golden ages of like at least the way we historically have thought about golden age, right? You're like it's a much more messy and um, vibrant kind of world.
It is messy, but I think, I think a lot of times golden ages are conceived of by people to inspire them, to inspire them into creating a golden age in the future.
Right,
And if you look at every last group, many groups harken back to some ideal time that, if you look into the historical record, really wasn't anything like that.
right,
But what they're doing is they're creating, like I've heard so many Hindus talk about Vedic times,
yeah,
you know, Vedic time.
yeah,
And if you ask them when Vedic times were, what Vedic times were like, there's nothing there.
yeah,
There's no historical basis for it. They just have no sense. Like they'll think, oh, there were giant, beautiful temples in Vedic times. It's
no,
like, no, they didn't build temples really. It
no,
was very much an outdoor kind of, do it yourself, build your own, mandala that you would put in
right,
place
right,
and certain orientation relative to the cosmos. And so again, there's not very much historical knowledge.
right,
If you look at Muslims, they talk about the time of the Prophet, the rightly guided early Muslims, but like they would not want to live back then because there was slavery and this and that, all sorts of stuff that they would be horrified by
right,
if they saw it in front of their faces in the modern world. And similarly, Christians in Europe, they look around at their society and they're like, oh, it was so great 200 years ago. It's like, really, when Napoleon was tearing up your countries, you know what I'm saying?
right,
Like, but again, it's all mental. It's all a mental projection into the
right,
future. You know?
right.
The past golden age is actually the vision of the future golden age.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like every age or every time period looks in the past either in the sense of that was better back then or oh we're so much better than it was before,
Right,
and it's
right,
like and I'm like I don't know how much we've oscillate like this. There's ebbs and waves.
right.
Like our material life is so much better today,
It is
and
objectively, yeah,
but there's a lot missing here in this life too, which is like
right.
which you go to India and this is in a big city like LA, you don't get this sense where you walk down the street, someone invites you to their house to have dinner. Right in India, that can happen at any given time. Like
Right.
there's the community knows each other, cares about each other in a certain way, right? Like there's a
Even
even
that, I think that might be declining in the urban settings.
it is
Yeah,
sure, yeah, and that's part of modernity, part of like this hyper industrialization and mechanizations of
right,
human beings into cogs in a machine for corporate
right,
economic goods
right.
versus like inner growth and
Yeah,
our own purposes.
right.
So there's always this give and take, and like so, I always wonder like 100 200 years from now people going to look past in this time and be like oh man, that was the golden age, or are they going to end up saying, oh, that was a terrible age? Because, you know,
Right.
there's
Right.
ebbs
I
and
mean,
flows.
yeah, it does. And I mean, they'll probably look at certain things and be horrified. They'll look at factory farming and probably be horrified by
Yeah.
it. They'll look at they'll probably look at our air quality in a lot of our cities and be like, well, they were breathing that. How is that
The
possible?
obesity epidemics, the
City, all that stuff. They'll look back on that and be like, yeah, times were horrific back then. But you know, will we won't be around, but will we at this point in time know that it's good in some ways and bad in some ways?
yeah,
And if you're honest with yourself, no matter what the historical period is, they're good things and they're bad things.
right.
With very rare instances, you know, maybe, Europe in the 1940s when, there was World War going on.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, everything's bad then. Okay,
Right,
that's
right,
I'll give you that. But for the most part, if you're just looking at a regular world, like a regular society in peacetime,
right.
there's good things and there's bad things. And but that doesn't really play into anybody's propagandistic narrative, you know?
No, it doesn't. And and before we get on to the diasporic stuff, which this connects to, like I kind of want to still stick with your work on the Mahabharata. Now, like
Yeah.
the Gita, I get, right? That's like it's a beautiful poem. It has some deep spiritual truths and psychological truths, which I think people focus way more on the spiritual truths than they do on the psychological truth. And I think that's like,
Yeah, the Guna theory is psychological truth, right?
yeah,
It's a psychology. It's like Freud or Jung or something
right.
in ancient Sanskrit form.
Even his ideas of like krodat bhavati samoha samoha
Yeah.
smriti brahmshat buddhi nasha, right? This entire flow of how our attachment to an object leads to anger, leads to this, leads to, it's a direct one-to-one correlation to how I think our minds actually do function. And
Mm-hmm.
like he's putting forth a psychological theory about the nature of the mind and how it interplays with the world, and then he's giving us solutions. And I think what a lot of people tend to focus on is, oh, let's just talk about the spiritual aspect of like, he's God, he's saying do this, do this, do this.
Right.
But the psychological aspect is just as important, I
It is,
think. And
absolutely. And to be honest with you, uh, I would say that he devotes at least as much time to that aspect of things.
right.
The Guna theory is huge in the Gita,
Yeah.
and you don't really hear too much about it. I agree with you on that. When people talk about the Gita, they don't talk about that as much.
Right.
But he goes through extensively, even in the last adhyay,
Yeah.
right before the end, he starts launching into a very systematic, this is how they eat, this is what they do,
Right.
this is that. It's all there. And it's all he's very, very interested in it. And I think it's because they regarded um, the gunas as as very much a spiritual shackles,
Yeah.
And so it's not as though they entirely distinguish, as we are verbally distinguishing between the psychological and the spiritual. And in the end, the Greek
It's the
word
same.
for spirit is psyche,
Psyche.
right?
Yeah.
Mind or psyche. Psyche
Yeah.
is originally a spirit, I think. It has something to do with that. And so, I think that he regards the gunas as something you have to transcend. And so he's careful to describe them in detail so you know what you're trying to shake free from.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just on a side note, I was listening to another podcast this week with Wendy Doniger comes on,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it was pretty. I mean, I thought it was pretty horrific. But she was just like, the Gita is one of the most vile books. She said made a comment about like how it basically allows you to justify killing for killing's sake or whatever it is, and I'm like, you're like a premier Indologist that people like look to you to be like this Indology guru, and this is the kind of comment you make about the Gita without understanding what's even happening in the text.
I know, but I think that a Doniger type mind
Even
is not.
Slava, what's his name, Zizek said that, something like that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that they don't necessarily have the mind necessary to understand that, and I think that people can be intelligent in different
Right.
domains, and they can be stupid in other domains, and if you ask me to for example, analyze, the Bengals defense, right, in a football game, I would perhaps make some comments that would strike you as extremely stupid, and strike a defensive coordinator as really stupid.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that just because somebody learned Sanskrit, like Audrey Trishke knows Sanskrit, right?
Right.
Just basically somebody learns Sanskrit, or somebody knows a lot of facts about
Right.
a given tradition. It doesn't mean that they can inhabit the tradition, or more importantly, model the mind, or have a model of mind of the other, because they
Right.
remain in a position of otherness relative to their subject of study. They will tell you that that's actually a virtue. It's like, I am outside of this tradition,
Right.
and therefore my insights are objective. And the truth is that um, there are insights that are um, perhaps more accessible to an outsider,
Mhm.
but there are also insights that are exclusively accessible to an insider.
Right.
And I think Doniger will never understand that. And Doniger cannot understand the context of the Gita. Because remember, the Gita occurs after the Krishna Vrishti. It happens after they go to Hastinapur. Krishna goes to Hastinapur and says, all we're asking for is 5 villages.
Udyoga, yeah, the Udyoga Parva, yeah.
Yeah. And basically, they try and Duryodhana tries and arrests him, right? And so the context of the lead up to the Gita is that we have done everything possible to completely avoid a war which we know is going to be horrific, and which we know is going to be the end, or the extinction of the Kuru line, and usher in the Karyug. Okay, we know this is a terrible thing. We're not even asking for our half of the kingdom back. We're not asking for anything other than a place to sleep, basically. We're asking for 5 villages. And it is when this is rejected, and the messenger, Krishna, is basically the sanctity of his diplomatic immunity is violated. It is at that moment that war becomes a necessity. And then basically Krishna, and then Arjuna is still having this despair after the armies are lined up. And then Krishna is not exhorting him to kill for go on a killing spree. He's not exhorting him to start a war. He's exhorting him to finish the war that they could not avoid in spite of their best efforts, which is extremely different than framing the Gita as saying, you can kill whoever you want, just go do it. You know, totally different. And yet, can a Wendy Doniger understand that? Even though she probably knows the story of the Mahabharata. I don't think she's ignorant of the story of the Mahabharata. I don't think she's ignorant of the text of the Gita. Can she put those two things together and have a holistic understanding of the context of the Gita and the context of the message of the Gita? No, clearly not. Clearly not. Proof is in the pudding. Proof is the fact that she made a stupid statement like that. And can I hold it? I mean, it's natural for us to hold it against her. I think um, it's an abuse of her platform, but I don't think she knows that she's abusing her platform. I think that she regards herself as having superior knowledge to people like you and me. You know what I'm saying? Wait, your microphone, your microphone.
You hear better? Sorry.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in that sense, she definitely thinks she knows more than the insiders in the tradition too, right? Like,
Right.
oh, I'm, Harvard trained, University of Chicago professor. I spent 2 years, 3 years, 4 years in India in,
Yeah.
the 60s or whatever. I know more than the Panditas. I know more than this. Like when I look through, I'll be honest, there's a lot of Western scholars I find have good insights. Some of the insights are well worth considering within a tradition and bringing in and engaging with. The other issue that arises is sometimes like they take conjectures and make them reality. Like for example, I think Bronkhurst in large part of his work in like the greater Magda tradition or whatnot, he makes conjectures in the beginning of the book, and by middle it's solid fact, and then by the end, it's like, oh yeah, there's no sense that we need to still take those as conjectures. Um, but the same way they will not give to the tradition themselves. When, for example, like the tradition says, the Pancharatra tradition says, oh, we come from this shaka of the Veda. They'd be like, well, there's no connection between the two. But I'm like, you just made a bunch of different connections in your theory that aren't connected, and you accept those. So part of that, I think, is like there's engagement needs to be much more integrated within the Indian traditions. And a lot of times I also find because I've done a good in my time on this podcast, I've talked to a lot of scholars. They'll say one thing in public and then feel another thing in private, right? They'll make their, which is fine, I think. They'll make the claims, but they're like, actually, I think there's more to what I'm trying to say here than I'm actually saying because I just
Right.
can't make the academic claim.
Right. I think that part of this has to do with the nature of academia and
Yeah,
knowledge production in academia. So Bronkhurst has to, and I have not, I've heard his name and I've read some very superficially about his work,
yeah,
but I think that in general, a Bronkhurst-like figure, his role in Indology relates to whether he can create a framework that then gets propagated or taken up by other Indologists in the generation afterwards. And so he presents his framework and he simultaneously is teaching that to everybody who studies under him
right,
in order to create a sort of legacy and yes, in a sense, alter reality or put his stamp on reality
right,
uh, or on the past, right? And to that end, they will do they will do violence against the truth, but maybe not necessarily even violence. They will simply frame things in ways that are not necessarily justifiable based on the record because there's not enough information there, but they'll do it, they'll fill it out the way they can, and then they'll create a picture, create a coherent framework, which they can then propagate. And the other element within academia is that they're all, much as influencers are all competing for clicks.
yeah,
Unfortunately, in academic Indology, they are increasingly competing for outrage. And they specifically want people who are inside the tradition or who revere the tradition or have a religious attachment to the tradition to be angry at them. And that becomes their currency. Somebody at one point, some rando threw an egg at Wendy Doniger
yeah.
years ago. And for the next
Was
two
it-
decades,
Yeah.
she mentioned it in literally every interview she ever did.
Oh yeah, yeah. I remember that.
One egg, all right? And I think that one of the problems with our tradition is that we do not have strict mechanisms of, um, we don't have a single narrative, we don't have a single credo. So we allow 1,000 speculative flowers to bloom, and people abuse that openness. They abuse that lack of, people coming out to slit your throat if you say something that they don't like.
Right,
Religions that do have a single narrative, that have clear red lines, and that slit your throat if you say something they don't like, have a competitive advantage in this environment. And unless and I don't think Hindus have the stomach or the um, lack of conscience necessary to behave in that way. And so that's just going to continue. And you can just you speak what you know to be true,
right,
and then you basically have to throw up your hands and let these people run their mouths because none of us is going to take up the machete. Nobody is, right?
right,
And it's a weakness, but at the same time, I mean, it's a virtue, but it's a weakness. Virtue can be
right.
a weakness. All right, virtue can be a weakness, and that's just how
And
we
that's
are.
all. That's the whole point of context, right? Again, it goes back to the Gita in the Mahabharata. The context of a virtue can also be a weakness. But
Right.
it's just again on a side note, it's interesting because like when you sometimes read this on scholars and they'll be like, Rudra in the Vedas is not the same as Shiva, who's a Dravidian god. And then, and you're like, but where are you making these connections?
Right.
Krishna and Vishnu are two separate gods. Krishna is a local tribal deity, and Vishnu is his, and there's no connect. And you're just like, but do you have any data that there was a tribal deity named Krishna? Do you have any data that there was a tribal deity named Shiva that was separate from Rudra? No, we're just speculating because we're treating the way they treat the Rig Veda in some sense is like as if this text, the Mantra Samhita, is the society that was fully there at the time of the Vedic, as if there wasn't other branches of knowledge that might have been
Right.
relevant here, right? Like,
Because I think that what you're referring to relates to basically incomplete or partial records of a society, right? So one of the interesting things that one of the interesting examples of this is Jasper's axial age, right? Have you heard of
yeah,
like axial age
yeah,
religions?
yeah, around
And
600 BCE,
yeah,
all over the
300
world. Yeah,
BC, and
yeah,
he's basing that on the extant textual records from the basically Eurasian landmass,
right,
right? He doesn't know what was going on in North America or South America. He doesn't know what was going on in Africa. He doesn't even know the evolution of Egyptian religion, many of which texts are lost.
right.
Um, but were at the time, as I said, at the time of Plato, they were very old indeed at that point, and they were
Thousands of
considered
years
the
old.
great sages. They were considered the great sages of in Periclean Athens. If you ask, hey, you want to learn great wisdom, where would you go? They go to Egypt.
Egypt,
And
yeah,
so, yeah, and so basically, what is Jasper's really basing his grand theory on? He's basing it on
the Greeks.
little fragments, and then he's just creating a sort of narrative out of that. Of what use is that? I mean, you have to, in science, these things are a little bit more difficult to pull off because
Mhm.
you have to have a certain amount of data. There's a certain amount of rigor that a sort of you have to basically show things with like statistical
Right,
verifiability. There has to be replicability. You can't just in the medical world you can't just speculate and be like, I think that if I give you this drug it's going to do this, but in these humanities or in history, in primarily verbal disciplines that don't have um, a check in the form of reality. Basically, they can uncouple from reality and become pure dances of words, right?
right,
And that's what you see when you see these scholars very pompously and self-confidently hypothesize it. And the way they say it, they make it sound like it's a fact or that it's been studied or that it's been established. But if you know anything about the Indian textual tradition, archaeological remains, um, and basically what has survived over all
yeah,
these years with monsoons and heat, you realize that there ain't that much. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
There's not that much. There's a lot, but considering how big India is and how many different traditions have coexisted, and in many cases left no textual trace whatsoever,
right.
uh, and in many cases left no
Physical
architectural
trace,
whatsoever.
right?
All right. Then you realize like if the Naga sadhus were not around right now, we would barely know anything about them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, almost nothing. Yeah,
If they existed 2,000 years ago, at which point the Indian tradition was already old, they didn't write any books, they didn't build any temples, and they didn't carve any murtis. How are you going to know anything about them?
right,
What would you know? You wouldn't know anything.
right.
And so this is a problem, but it's yeah, I mean and it's and a lot of times it can feel a little bit disheartening because you know that if you do speak the truth, even truth that's not jingoistic, all right, just
Right.
simply these are the limitations of your knowledge and our knowledge. Everyone's knowledge is limited in this way. They won't let you through. They're not going to publish you.
Yeah,
That's
it's interesting that way too because like there's this there's this area where I think like the Indo-European work that people are doing and engaging in, you it's much broader than I think a lot of just Indologists look at in some sense, right? Like there's a lot of times I think the way they approach it is if it doesn't fit into our current narrative of Indo-European, it must come from somewhere else. And you're
Right.
just like, well, mm, again, just like our society, even today, like if we didn't have knowledge of, let's say, uh, the fact that there's LARPers out in the world that are actually doing LARPing in, college campuses and pretending to play these role playing games and live
Mhm.
action. We would have no sense of what they are. We would just say those things didn't exist, but they're part of
Right.
our society. And there's in societies like Rig Vedic times or ancient Homeric times, there was a lot more going on than just the text is saying. Because the
Right.
text is dealing with a small sliver of society
Right.
and
Right.
maybe bringing in the things that are relevant for the purposes of the text or the
Right.
tradition that they're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mahabharata is unique that way because, and this is where we can maybe demarcate between the Greek traditions of the Iliad, Odyssey, Hesiod, Theogony, all that stuff, and the
Yeah.
Mahabharata. Because the Mahabharata is this like whatever it was the attempt to make the greatest single text to bring as much of Indic knowledge together in one place to
Right.
to keep it going.
Right.
So, which is why, like some people like say it's a monstrosity. I think the Germans, the during the time of like the 1800s and early 1900s that were studying the text would be like, this is a monstrosity. It makes no sense. But I think as people have started studying it more and more, they're saying, especially someone like a scholar like Alf Hiddlebiddle. I forget.
Mhm.
I always mess up his name, but
Mhm.
he and Bardou make the argument that text is actually pretty coherent as a single narrative.
Mhm.
And it's like even the little stories that come out, the didactic portions are meant to be there from the get go,
Right.
which is a really which I think the tradition itself has been saying for a long time. It is just this is one story trying to give one like continuity of narration with as much knowledge as we can preserve and put into it in the context.
I think that I would split the difference here. I think that the Homeric epics are highly constructed um, and more unitary than the Mahabharata. I think that they were sort of designed for sequential or episodic performance. I think that the Mahabharata is v- kind of like, um, for example, the Iliad doesn't include the Trojan horse. It doesn't include the onset of the war or the abduction of
Nope.
Helen. It's like a specific set of days.
That last year, that last
Yeah,
few months, yeah,
specific incidents, the wrath of
yeah,
Achilles, and how he avenges himself on Hector, and and I think that um, the Mahabharata is basically like the internet of
yeah,
the story, right?
yeah,
And so if you just had if you took the internet and right now and you searched Mahabharata and then you got all the hits from the Mahabharata and you printed them all out and you made a book out of them, right? You would have a tremendous amount of material and it would all relate to the Mahabharata, right? Now, analogously, the text of the Mahabharata that we have, it begins, with Shantanu, with King Shantanu. It
mhm,
begins with like at the beginning, okay? And it takes us all the way past the mutual self-slaughter of the Yadavas to Yudhishthir and everybody ending up in heaven and all of
yeah,
that. It's the whole kit and caboodle. It is basically the equivalent of the entire Homeric cycle
yeah,
in one book. And on top of that, it is something that intentionally, as you mentioned, intentionally digresses in order to contain, it's kind of like Aesop has the moral of the story at this particular point
hmm
in Aesop's fables. Well, Bhishma is going to give a lecture on statecraft now, and we have this is where it belongs, and this is the right place to put it because this at this particular point when he's talking to Yudhishthir, he has more authority. That's where his authority is. and it has dramatic significance, so it's going to hit different than if it was just given by somebody at some other time. So we're going to put this right here, you know, and so it's not the Iliad or the Odyssey; it's the whole Homeric cycle.
Right, right.
You know?
No, so and that's absolutely true because like even within the Mahabharata, you contain the Ramayana. There's like
Right there, there,
three
there,
different
there is
versions of tellings
Ramakakyan.
of
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
There's three different versions of it told in there, and then
yeah.
there's Nala Damayanti story, which is
Right.
like
I have that in
yeah,
mind. Yeah. Yes.
which is the idea again. Like the moment that those stories are told is when Yudhishthira is whining about, oh, woe is me. This is
Right.
the who else is has a terrible as me, and then his sage, I think it was Domya or it was I think it was Domya, tells him the story of Rama and tells him the story of Nala Damayanti. He's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, these people had it maybe had it worse, right? So
Right. Right.
these
Those are
stories,
those are that in the Gita. So in the second volume of my Mahabharata trilogy, which takes you from the dice game to the outset of the war.
yeah,
Um, Basically, in that middle volume, I made sure to do verse retellings of Nala and Damayanti and of the Gita.
yeah,
Um, and so the second volume actually contains an entire Gita written in contemporary verse, not a translation, but basically recreated for the modern world. Um, and it also contains, earlier in that same volume, it contains a rhymed retelling of the Nala and Damayanti story.
yeah,
And so basically, I think those are very, very crucial digressions or crucial contained stories because they have um, so much, they have such a relationship to the plot, you know?
right.
There are other side stories that don't have any relationship to the plot, but
I think I don't think they have direct
there
relationship
are
to the
minor ones
plot.
that are just there. I mean, it's you can make a tangential connection, I guess, but like they're not as you know like the Null and Damayanti story has like a dozen sort of harmonics with the story that's going on as we
Right,
speak.
right.
The Gita has basically a crucial element of the plot. It is part of the plot. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
So I don't think that every digression is of equal weight or value. Um,
Well, I mean, so
yeah.
I think there's two elements here that we there's a narrative element that absolutely you might be correct, but then there's the mythic element that I think sometimes is not touched upon, right? Like for example, like even the story in the beginning of Jatakartu or Astika, right? These
Mhm.
characters seem like they're throwaways. They're like throwaway characters, and for what purpose? And then you understand the mythic nature of these characters, like what Astika means, what Jatakartu means, in the Vedic sense, and what they connect to there. And then
Mhm.
the story plays out. Like for example, the story Uttanka pops up in the Mahabharata, right? The Uttanka has to go get the earrings of the queen, and then he has to go to the lower levels with Indra powering his stick to become like Vajra like, and he
Uh-huh.
blow out the end of a horse, all this other stuff.
Right.
They're all like it's out there, but the connection to the story is very important because the connection is later connected to in the Gita. I mean, past the Gita when Krishna meets Uttanka and has a conversation with him. So there's elements that are disparately connected that won't make sense until some other point in the story, and
Yeah,
there
yeah,
might be a
I see
theme
that.
they
I
touch.
see that point. I think that I guess for my purposes, as a doing a kind of a retelling,
Right.
I was much more interested in creating three books that would have each one a Homeric unity unto
Yeah.
themselves. And so I want that individual book, like even if you pick up the middle book or even if you pick up the first book, it has like a build and an arc and then like
Sure.
it hits you,
Right.
and I think that's why there was streamlining that I did, but I
You
do
have to.
see, yeah, I do see the point that you're making. But yeah, I think for my purposes, it wasn't necessarily something that I could do, or even, I mean, it would have been a lot bigger than three books if I had
It would
included
have
them.
been a full 18
Yeah,
volumes of
yeah,
just all the
exactly,
like but
exactly.
that's the thing. It's like when you do retellings, you do have to figure out what is like the core of this of the thing you
Right,
want to retell, right? And that is like a re-envisionment for the whatever purposes is, right?
right,
Mahabharata has a much larger like Vyasa's Mahabharata is
right,
meant to go get to a larger audience, both the Vedic people that can read the text and see those motifs, but also the
Yeah.
regular people, right? The Mahabharata itself calls itself a Sri Shudra Moksha Shastra, right? The
Mm.
Panchama Veda, for the idea that for people that can't have access to the Vedic truths in the Vedic Upanishads that can't understand it, the Mahabharata is going to give it to you in a way
Right.
that's narrative, in a narrative consumable nature, right?
Right.
Like,
Maybe not,
Indra's,
the
yeah.
text itself, perhaps not, but like I think that in the way epics traditionally worked, even in ancient Greece and
Mhm.
in our and in Hindu in our culture even now, is that they're the source texts,
Yeah,
but they're meant to flower into different types of genres and
right.
forms, whether it's a puppet play or a movie
Yeah,
or songs or this or that or TV show, whatever, what have you,
yeah.
So I love seeing that. I love seeing how they still live. They still live in India and among Hindus, and
But but the cool
so
part is narrative fidelity doesn't matter. What
right,
matters is like thematic, like elements of that rasa, right? That bhava
right,
rasa, and like when
right.
you read like something like Karna Bhara, or what's Duryodhana's Urubanga. I don't know if you read.
Urubhanga, yeah,
Yeah,
Urubhanga, yeah,
yeah. Those are beautiful, but the character changes, right? His character, his like, but the bhava is like present, like it's, I think that's the idea within the Hindu tradition in many ways is, yeah, there's an ur text, and maybe this text is great for these purposes, but it's yours to use, to
right,
flower with, to grow, like you said, like, branch out. It just,
yeah.
all those things can be true at the same time.
And the ancient Greeks used to do it too. So all
Yeah,
those Greek tragedies, they depart from Homer in various ways. They depart from the traditional telling in various ways too. So I think that's just part and parcel of you know the sort of um, mythological religion, because
right,
just as languages are constantly changing in different ways, in certain senses, the stories are changing in
right,
subtle ways as well. There's a little drift that occurs, and I think that you know um, you can probably see it in the story in Rama, right? The figure of Rama. If you compare Valmiki's Rama to Tulsidas's Rama two
very
thousand years
different, right.
there's a difference. There's a huge
Oh,
difference, you know. And so I think that's just part of the living nature of it. It's a beautiful thing. It can be, and again, that can also be abused. Unfortunately, that can
sure.
be abused.
But those are, like, again, those are highlighting different elements of Rama's character and stories, and I think that's part of the beauty of, I would say, the mythic traditions, as you call it, or I think rightfully so, is there, the truth matters more than quote unquote the reality. I think
Right.
that's like, I think that is deeply under, like, when you look at Christianity or Islam, in that sense, like, the text says what the text says, and that's it. If you go
Yeah.
beyond the text, you add more to the text. It's we're not comfortable with that, right?
Right. Right.
Outside of the
Right.
bounded frameworks, you can't depict Jesus differently than you would
Well, they were doing that from the very beginning, so
right.
that's why they have apocryphal gospels. I mean, these
Yeah, but those
apocryphal.
are all out of the book, out of the
Yeah, I
whack
mean,
now, right?
they're not allowed into the Bible because
Right.
they're a little bit unpleasant. Like there's the infancy gospel of
Yeah,
Thomas
Thomas.
where basically Jesus kills some kids. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like in India, that would have been taken up by enemies of Hinduism or something like that. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Like they'd be
Yeah.
like Rama killed two kids when he was a kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? They'd be all over that, and there'd be no way to keep it out. That's why the Uttarakhand is actually fan fiction that was added
Oh yeah.
hundreds of years later onto Valmiki's Ramayana.
Yeah.
And now I actually wrote a Sitayana at one point, 2019,
Yeah.
and I would be, you know, I was at this one literary festival, and another person had written a similar, Ramayana thing, and the whole time we're talking about the Uttarakhand as if it really happened and as if it was like a
No.
definite part of the story, and I had to be in the position of being like, yes, it's there, but it was just added on, and like, you know what I'm saying, like, and so but now I think it's almost like that's like the reality now, and I think that's why the early Christians knew what they were doing. They had a certain sense of the danger of keeping things open source and just welcoming fan fiction into it. You know what I'm saying? So they knew what they were doing. I mean, they're shrewd in various ways.
Right, but even I mean, I agree with you. I think Uttarakhanda was added later. But
There's a scholarly consensus about
yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah.
Not barely even an opinion at this point.
Yeah, it's. I mean, even within the tradition itself, it's changing too. To say it's actually the tradition itself calls it a killa. It doesn't even call it part of the full Ramayana. It's called the killa, right? The appendix, added on later at some point.
Gumpan's Tamil Ramayana doesn't even include it, if I'm not mistaken.
No, no, and it's interesting. Bhavubati's um, Ramayana,
Uttar Ramcharita?
Uttar
Is that
Ramacharita, right? He dells with the same issues, but he gives it a different spin, right? Where like what's his name? Shambhuka's ghost is engaging. Rama's sad about it, and he has issues with doing the action, right? And so
Mhm.
like it's then you look at the text like Ramayana versus Uttarakhanda, and like Rama's character changes really really drastically. So you can tell there's clear indications there. But the cool part of also within the tradition is that it can find a way to make even that fit in some sort of thematic spiritual sense,
Mhm, mhm.
which is both a strength and weakness in
Yeah.
context.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's it may, you know, the status of Rama has only increased and continued to increase. So clearly, it didn't have it didn't have a dampener effect. So I don't even know whether that matters, because if you can put something like that on him, arbitrarily, and the juggernaut of his reputation just continues to grow, and people love him, and people are all over him. That's powerful. It's just powerful. And again, that's sort of one of the things about Hinduism, the Hindu tradition in general. Um, you know you read about what happened, you read about the various elements and various things, and you kind of think to yourself, how did this survive? Like, how did this survive? How did this flourish? How did this continue? But it's amazing, because I think that it's truly a mystery. It's truly a mystery how it can just survive all this stuff and still come out swinging. It's interesting. Your microphone.
Ah,
There. I can.
there we
Yeah,
go.
yeah.
I know I've taken about an hour and a half of your time. I want to.
Fine. I don't have to work till 8, so we can keep going if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the one thing, like I think that's relevant for the diaspora today, um, shifting from ancient past and storytelling and myth making to modern, I guess, mythization and vilification. In the
Which
past
is
few
myth
weeks,
making in it, which is also myth making, by
yeah, that's right.
the way.
So in the past, like past few weeks, we've seen this, especially in the diaspora in the U.S., this blow up of Indians and their role, whether they belong in this country or not. Um, you know, what are your thoughts? What are your you're born here. I wasn't born here. I came here when I was like 2 months old, but
Oh
still
yeah,
relatively. Like,
yeah.
I'm as American as apple pie. I think so.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts like on this stuff?
I think that I'm not all that worried about it, to be honest with you. I think that um, you know, unfortunately, propaganda works on some people, but its reach is limited when you are of use to the plutocrats who run the country. You know what I'm saying? And there's gonna definitely be backlash from uh, powerless, angry people, you know, as we show up on their radar, because there's a lot of frustration, and there's a lot of there's a lot of resentment and frustration, um, and really they're just looking for a place to direct it, and it's easy to direct it at us, but there are far more demonized minorities in the country than us. And I think that we have probably, because we are in that particular corner of Twitter or that particular, you know, social media environment, we see a lot of it and we're like, oh, they're coming after us. In reality, it's a fraction of the animosity that is being directed at much more powerful groups, much more numerous groups. Um, and that's why I feel like part of it is the distortion effect of being Hindus, seeing Hindus talked about, not being that used to it. Because let's face it, I've lived here for 45 years and we just never come up. You know what I'm saying? Now we came up for about a week, you know, for some pretty milk toast stuff. You know what I'm saying? It's like there's 75,000 of you taking tech jobs. It's like, okay, you know. So really milk toast stuff, a bunch of powerless people, angry, powerless, anonymous people saying nasty things. Okay, and then a week later they're talking about, you know, uh, Anglo-Pakistani gang rape violence. You know what I'm saying? And it moves on, right? And eventually it'll circle back, and maybe at that point, you know, people will get nervous again, but I'm not that nervous. Having said that, history is history. Anything can happen, especially when you're just a 1%, um, you know, not particularly politically organized minority. But for now, at least, I have faith in America and faith in the, you know, law and order. Um, Having said that, the way technology is, anybody can get a gun, anybody can shoot anything up, you know? And really, the only danger to our community, in my opinion, the main danger to our community is some sort of person who is poisoned by online propaganda, who gets a gun and knows that there's a temple there or there's a gathering there, and then basically commits a, you know, stochastic terroristic violence against us. That's the danger when propaganda poisons the waters. Um, and I really hope and pray that nothing like that happens.
Yeah, I think I share the same sentiments. I think, these are, I think there's a couple things that I think for Hindu Americans, and I think, this is where, even though you and I might see a difference in Hindu Americans and Indian Americans, I think a large part when people talk about Indian Americans in America, they're basically referencing Hindu Americans.
They are. They
Yeah,
are. I mean, they don't see they don't see a distinction. They don't.
right.
Yeah.
So like part of the thing is, this over focus on, I think, just growing up and seeing like we're so different in many ways. But we're, in terms of our gods, our eating habits, our, things like those things might be a little different. But like we are deeply integrated to American culture, society, where we have been for past 30, 40 years, like basically non-problematic, right? We're just kind of part of the world. There's this movement, I think, is just that strikes me as this nativist movement arising because of the nature of America becoming true to what I think America was originally meant to be, this melting pot of peoples and cultures, and they don't want that, right? And there's a small contingent, a group of powerless people, I think mostly, that are pushing this. I'm not afraid on the whole that anything's going to happen to our community large scale, right? Like I don't think we're going to be shipped out. We're going to lose jobs or anything like that, because the beauty of America is also a meritocracy. Like if we're good at what we do and you need that role filled, you'll fill it with good people.
Mm.
But I am scared, like you said, of over time this violence arising, like we have seen with Muslims in the country, a mosque attack, or you've seen black churches attacked or synagogues
Synagogues.
attacked. Yeah,
Synagogue.
so
I think
that's the
that
fear.
I think that it's more likely that and to be honest with you, in Canada, this thing has already happened, and it was just Calistanis doing it, right? It wasn't even the white natives doing it or the white population doing it. So we do have enemies. If it isn't the populist whites, it could be Calistanis or somebody. And there's different people who have it out for our community. But again, there's a lot of other communities that are significantly more under the gun than us. And really, this is just us getting a little taste of that. And I hope that it doesn't, I hope and pray that it doesn't translate into anything more serious. But we should be aware that at some point it very well may. And it's almost, I won't say it's certain that it will, but it's highly likely that at some point something's going to happen. And you know, it's just in the nature of being anywhere, and I hope that it doesn't happen. But
Right. And do you think it's in this sense, like we're really talking about Deracination, do you think our attempts to become more integrated into American society, at the cost of our culture, in some sense, our own background, have have borne fruit, or is anything like this a consequence of that? You think?
I think that it's very well. You and I, we've been here for decades, and we grew up in a different America. The America today is very different, in part because there are so many Indians, so many more Indians now, and the at this point, it also is a question. What American culture are you assimilating to? Now, anybody listening to you and me talk, if they just turned off, their screens and they just heard our voices, we would sound like two white Americans talking, right? That's just one of many American cultures now. I've heard Indian Americans who speak with and whose vocal patterns match those of Black Americans, um, Hispanic Americans, right? Basically, there's not going to be any dominant or single dominant American culture to assimilate to in the first place. Um, the the most advantageous one is our culture to assimilate to is the professional culture for people like us. So there's a sort of raceless, classless, uh, professional or managerial culture in the country, um, where all the lawyers, doctors, and tech people kind of speak the same language. It's a derivative of white American speech, but it doesn't have any regional flavoring, if you'll notice, right? It's basically derived from newscaster speech, right? Which is kind of like how we sound, whether or not we realize it. 100 years ago, Americans from different parts of the country used to sound nothing like each other. New Englanders used to sound like this, and Texans used to sound like this. Completely divergent accents. But now you go to downtown Austin, you go to downtown Boston, you go to downtown even Boston, and you go to their professionals in the high rises. They all kind of sound like this, right? And so when we talk about assimilation, you don't got to give up nothing. You don't got to give up your food. You don't have to give up your religion. You don't have to give up your language. You don't have to give up your names. You don't have to give up anything because there's nothing to give it up to. And all you have to do is master skills, speech, and then hopefully um, America will remain a country where you can get ahead with skills and a nice personality. You know what I'm saying? Like, who knows? Who knows? Things can change, and people are trying to change it. People are trying to change it and make it harder for Indian Americans to get ahead, Asians to get ahead. Oh, you're a privileged class. You should be discriminated against. That already exists. It
Right.
existed when I applied to college. It existed when I applied to anything, right? Um, it's going to be easier for certain people who have a leg up because of various initiatives. And we should just regard that as part and parcel of living in a multi ethnic society where you don't want there to be a proletarianized racial or ethnic group. You want elites or the best performers within each group to be permitted to enter the professional classes,
Right.
even if they can't necessarily outcompete, some of the highest performers of certain pre-selected groups. Indian Americans are a pre-selected group. There's no way that the Indian hoi polloi could run across the border and get into America. For the most part, they're getting high scoring people who are coming over into specifically into STEM fields. 1 or 2 generations on, that's going to be a highly subselected population that assortatively mated into extremely, um, you know, extremely high performing individuals, basically. And you cannot allow that. It's more dangerous if we allow or if we push to have ourselves like a pure meritocracy, where basically us and a bunch of Asians and some Jews crowd into all positions of power and influence. That is actually more dangerous because at that point, um, resentment will. You think resentment's bad now?
Yeah.
You watch that when that skyrockets. If that were to happen, it would actually be worse for us. And I think a lot of people in their sort of resentment or rancor towards diversity initiatives, they forget that element, which is that you cannot proletarianize entire groups because your group happened to be subselected by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. It's bad news.
No, and I think that's what we saw in the 1940s or 1930s in Germany, right? You had a Jewish community that had rose in power in many, many ways.
They were
And
the same size, relative size as the
right,
Indian
right.
1%.
But because they got to power for however, they got there through merit, through hard work, whatever.
The
No,
emancipation of the Jews, right? Yeah,
right.
exactly.
So I mean, I think that, but I think America. I mean, America's, I believe, is built fundamentally different. It was, as much as people want to say it's started off as this ethno state of Anglo-Saxon purity.
I mean, it kind of did. I mean, they didn't give anybody
Yeah,
the vote. They didn't give anybody yeah, no, it has elements of that in its founding for sure. Yeah.
but the founding fathers also at the very core saw something bigger than just that. They understood that was the case at that time, but they even Thomas Jefferson in his writings about the separation of church and state, or the First Amendment, when they talked about it including Mohammedans and, as they called them, right, and Hindus and other people. They use those terms, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, they never imagined that there'd be these many of us. I don't think they ever
Yeah,
did.
but how could you? I mean,
You can't. But what I'm saying is,
yeah,
someone had told them, yeah,
yeah,
and then they're going to flood into your country and they're going to do this and do that.
yeah,
Then they'd be like, wait a minute. So you don't you they didn't have the historical imagination, like
no,
they can't have the prophetic imagination to know what America would look like now.
no,
I do think that they did believe that and that's in the actual nuts and bolts
right,
of it, where white male landowners should and to truth be told, I mean that is something, because remember they were basing it on ancient Greece. And in ancient Greece, they had a whole helot class that wasn't going to vote.
right.
They had
But
slaves.
the Helots were only Spartan, though. They weren't part of Greece. I mean,
Oh,
like,
sorry, not
yeah,
no, no. I mean, helots. No, the Athenians had slaves. They, they
yeah,
they were a slave holding society as well.
right.
Slaves did not get to vote or anything like that.
No,
It
no,
was,
the women didn't get to vote, and I totally
yeah,
get that.
exactly.
But I think the whole concept of America as an idea was like it's supposed to be iterative process, right? It's not stuck in this.
Right. I agree with you that it has turned out to be that way.
Yeah,
I don't know if the founding fathers necessarily thought of it that way, but I do believe that because America is alive and the idea of America is alive, it continues to change.
right.
People are
As
going to have
language
different
drift,
opinions.
everything does.
Yeah. So it's basically ideological drift in addition to linguistic drift and all the other types, cultural drift or whatnot.
Right.
So this is just ideological drift, and there's always going to be people who have differing opinions on that. And at this point in time, in spite of whatever political outcomes, short-term political outcomes, I don't think that the resentment driven or hatred driven people in the country currently have either the power or the demographic pressure to affect truly negative change. things, but you can be surprised how things turn out. But right now, I'm not perhaps as worried as maybe some people might be. But
Yeah, and I don't think I'm that worried too. It just for me, I feel like, but it could also be different for you and I because we grew up in this country, we know this country.
and
Whereas,
also, to be honest with you, you open your mouth and people
yeah,
treat you because
right,
they hear the words coming out of your mouth.
right,
If you spoke with a thick accent, would they treat you different?
yeah,
Quite possibly, right?
yeah,
I lived in Ohio my whole life. I talked to people. Like, hey, how are you doing? They're like, oh, this guy's one of ours. He's one of
yeah.
us, and it's purely based on voice. You know what I'm saying? And so who knows how people would treat me if I looked the same, but I talk with a thick accent. Who knows? So it may be different for different people. You're absolutely right. Yeah,
And so that's my fear is like, the people coming from India living here
yeah.
now, trying to build their lives, are feeling maybe the first time in their lives, in a true way, ostracized and in fear of their family lives, right? Just like, and that to me is, I think that is scary, right? At that level, because they already are subject to many of them to this green card lottery system, and and their entire existence in this country is like kind of
It's a little
shaky.
tenuous.
Yeah,
Having said that, in my experience, I mean, I grew up in at that time, it was an 86% white state, right? Um, and it's less now, but it's still, I mean, majority of people are white and
right.
people are quite nice. I mean, they're not nasty people. You
No,
know what I'm saying? Americans in general are actually, Midwesterners, I'll speak for Midwesterners, they're generally nice people. And you can find bad apples everywhere,
sure.
but for the most part, I mean, it's not my experience. It doesn't track to my experience. But as we said, my experience might be skewed by the fact that I grew up here. So
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Most Americans I know personally in my own life are very happy to have people like us around, and
right.
very happy for the diversity and different, like diversity brings different foods and different like
Yeah.
festivals and engagement with each other, and I think they're happy. And I think there's just a small set of, I mean, small relative. I mean, I don't know if it's like 10, 20, 15%, I don't know, of a population.
And also, we only get exposed to usually pretty educated people,
Right.
right? And we get exposed to people at a certain socioeconomic and educational level where we're not going to see, you know, other strata of society. We're not going to see that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure we'd probably be treated differently in different contexts, which
Yeah,
would
I
be
mean, I have a pretty eclectic group of friends. Many of them are from blue collar worker
yeah,
type
yeah.
of backgrounds, of white and Hispanic and black, and
In my
so
experience, everyone, and to be honest with you,
yeah,
I'm not trying to say that, blue collar people are negative or
right,
hateful. That hasn't been my experience at all.
no,
You know what I'm saying? I'm just saying that in general, Indians tend to interact
no, yeah,
with
that's right.
a certain, because they're professionals themselves by and large.
Except the 7-Eleven guys.
The hotel patels, they
Yeah, that's right.
they see the full spectrum of society.
Well, which is actually very interesting because I know I went to college with a couple of their kids, right? Like, and when they talked about how their parents, the lives they led, right? Like they would live in the motel, have a tiny little room where they
yeah,
all slept, went to
yeah,
school, dealt with robberies and all
yeah,
this stuff, and worked 20 hours, 30,
yeah,
all the time, family all. You're like, man, you guys deserve this. Like, you guys
yeah.
honestly you've earned
They're
anything.
they're 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 an amazing American success story, and somebody's got to write a nonfiction book about their rise because
Yeah.
it is basically an American epic waiting to be told of success. Like capitalist success in a society that are basically an open society. And it's
Right.
flattering to America itself that grit and hard work can pay off to that extent.
Right. And I think these are like the things that, you're right. America's also changed over the years where it's kind of opened the doors to new people and new ideas. And part of that is out of need and necessity themselves, right? And a part of it's also, I think, like the ethos kind of changed a little bit, and it's still changing. And I
Yeah.
think part of this, maybe I feel, is this white nationalist movement is like this death kneel cry for this
Mhm.
idea of whiteness. But to be frank, this idea of whiteness, idea of blackness, of brownness, and these colors is just stupid to me.
It is, but also, that too is destined to change. I think that
Right,
that those terms were very relevant during the civil rights era movements. Everyone has a hangover from that period in time because it was a clear sort of dichotomy.
hmm,
People had a sense of right and wrong, like who's right, who's on the right side, who's on the wrong side. It's very clear. It has a certain retrospective clarity because of the way history has been written about that time period. And so activists, for example, they really are centered on the whiteness and their, this and that. I don't think I think that's of less and less relevance going forward in American politics. I think that realignments are happening. Realignments already happened in 2024,
right,
and more realignments are coming down the pipeline where different groups and are going to sort into different camps. And remember, America's a two-party system. It's always going to be a binary. And I think that the coming binary is probably going to be a binary that's been replicated in places like South Korea and a few other places. It's going to be men versus women, and that's already
right.
happened. And that's a very, very pernicious divide, because it is a very, very pernicious divide, um, that basically causes estrangement between the sexes. Okay, and love decreases, relationships decrease, marriages decrease. You're already seeing that, and accordingly, happiness decreases. Okay, and I think over the coming years, and by the way, this is already the case. I think this has already happened. Democrats are very much the party of women. Republicans are increasingly the party of men, and this is a very pernicious thing going forward. But that's probably what you're going to see, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's
It's going to cut
that's that,
across racial lines. It's going to cut across racial lines.
that's dangerous. I mean,
Yeah,
that's very dangerous too.
yeah.
I, do you, do you think societies always need to have that other internally that they struggle with? Is this so? Do you think it's shifting? Like it went from being white versus others to now men versus women that might later come some other versus
Well,
each other.
remember, like, I think that societies, if you got people, if you have groups, at some point, conflict's going to happen.
Mhm.
And it's really just a question of how conflicts affect society and a social order, and B, whether those conflicts can be resolved in fruitful ways, and whether they have check valves or sort of release valves for the negative energy that is built up from conflict and friction and things like that, right?
Mhm.
And American democracy has been pretty good about having release valves ever since the Civil War.
Right.
Okay, so the Civil War, the release valves of the democratic process failed. There was an intractable conflict, and it turned into bloodshed.
Right.
Since then, it's been very successful. There's a lot of big, big problems, but in the end, the democratic process has allowed people to yell it out, argue it out, come up with legislation, move on, and things like that. And I do think that I hope that continues. You know,
Right.
I foresee that continuing for a while, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be ugly, in the rhetorical sphere, and especially in the age of social media. There's going to be things that you see online that are going to disturb you. There's going to be things said about your group, whatever group that is, Hindu, Indian, men, blah blah blah, that are going to disturb you or hurt you. And you just have to kind of realize that that's part of living in a democracy with free speech, which is that you're going to get offended, you're going to get hurt, and as long as social order doesn't break down, and as long as violence doesn't become the answer, um, you have to consider it a win in a certain sense.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think the idea of valves to let this out is very, very. I like the term. It's actually it's like the pressure valve, right? That's very good. Because I think America has had that with its past almost 200 years of going back and forth and negotiating with each other and different communities and finding a way to get to a place of in some sense not just toleration but like integration and respect. I think that's
Right.
been a great push. And yeah, and I think that the fear is, are we? And I think with the issues with the Trump situation last time, we were concerned that the vow had broken potentially.
Right,
That the,
right, right, right.
and I think the system showed itself to be strong enough to engage,
Right.
and to maneuver itself. But that also, I want to touch on one more thing before I let you go. Is you write, you read a lot, you're deeply engaged in in knowledge consumption. How do you think the world of social media and even the platforms we're on, X or whatever, is going to impact the way people do read and consume and engage and learn more? Do you think it's a net benefit, or do you think this is like?
Well, uh, it depends on the individual. So it's been a net benefit for me personally, because I've found book recommendations. I've encountered poems and ideas that I wouldn't have encountered otherwise. And there are many times where I'll find some snippet from a book that someone quotes, and I'll be like, "What's that?" And I'll go find it and I'll read it. I'm reading a book about the barbarian conversions in Europe from a random poster on I didn't even follow the person at the time, and they just said, "Oh, I like this book about this topic," and I was like, "Oh, let me look that up." So it's been a really great net benefit for me, and I've also made connections that have culminated in book deals, actually, to be honest with you. So I can't really say that it's a negative for me. The I only see the potential negative being that it would prevent people or young people from ever developing a habit of reading books at all. That strikes me as the number one damage that it could do and probably already has done. Me and my wife are avid readers. My daughter's an avid reader. I have twin sons. One of them is an avid reader, but one of them is not, you know? And I would think to myself, well, if social media didn't exist and this didn't exist and that didn't exist, YouTube shorts didn't exist, if he didn't have a phone, would he be a reader? Would he be an avid reader? Maybe,
Yeah,
but we'll never know, you know? And sometimes, he's on his phone and it's kind of like, you could be reading a book, right?
right.
So that's in a house with two people who like to read, being the parents. But you know, I feel like if the phone existed when I was 13, 14, 15, 16, I know for a fact I would have read fewer books.
Yeah,
Would I would I have read no books? Would I have just been like, "Oh, books take a long time. Let me just watch this clip," or "I'm curious about this. Let me watch this lecture on YouTube about it. It's only 10 minutes long."
yeah,
It's I think that's the danger, because I'm already formed. I'm already formed into a avid reader who just, you know, reads a lot. In books, I read books a lot. And I know for a fact, because I can compare and I know that books have a lot more information. You get a much deeper understanding from them. So yeah,
so
I think that's the main problem.
but
That's the
you know
danger.
what's interesting that I thought about was like, so books are, let's say, 500-year-old kind of experiment of sorts, right? We're for thousands of years total oral traditions for the most part. Like,
Yeah.
us learning something might be something we're taught orally, or in
Right, right,
relationship with somebody.
right, right.
We kind of in some sense going back to that, and
We
like we
are. No, no, we are, and I don't think that knowledge is going to die out. I
right,
don't think that knowledge transmission is going to die out. If anything, it's going to be supercharged.
you're right,
But I'm speaking specifically about books.
right.
I have a special, well, I have a vested interest in it because I create them. But
Right.
I also think that there's something in there that is profound, deep, and beautiful.
Hmm.
Fewer and fewer people are going to access. I don't think books are going to die out. I don't think books are going to become a thing of the past. I think they're going to coexist. Um, it's more that fewer and fewer people will access them and develop a love for them. So the love of books is not the same thing as a love of knowledge. You know,
Right.
love of books is its own thing, and a love of you know, uh, yeah, the books specifically, and that's what I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned about knowledge.
Right.
Knowledge is more accessible now than it has ever been.
But it's a type of consumption, right? Reading is there's different parts of your brain that are like kicking off, and it's the ability to also sit down with something, and those things are fixed, so you can think about that fixation of what that thing is saying, and write in it and engage with it in a different way than just I hear something and I think it back in the back of my mind, or
And
it's
also,
yeah,
your mind is supposed to wander when you read books.
right,
There's a lot of fruitful mind wandering that happens when you're reading something and then you go off on a tangent in your own brain and you kind of zone out for a bit, you think about something.
oh yeah, happens
Yeah,
all the time.
and that's crucial. Which when you have 20 different ads popping up and like
Yeah,
clip and then you're scrolling, that doesn't happen because you're constantly moved along.
right,
And basically, the time of divagation and wandering, the wanderlust of the mind is curtailed,
yeah,
and it's constantly pushed back here like this. What you want is your mind to wander, get to some place that you never foresaw.
yeah,
In that place, there may be a poem, there may be an insight, there may be a paragraph and a commentary that you're going to write someday. And then you're like, oh yeah, what was it? Oh yeah, yeah. Okay, now let me continue reading. You
yeah,
know, and this is something that is almost never discussed when people talk about reading, which is not reading but wandering.
right,
Because people think of wandering as aimless, but the whole point is, yes, it's supposed to be aimless. It's supposed to be non-directed. It's supposed to be um, serendipitous,
right,
and that is not replicated in the scrolling format. You know,
right,
there are other forms of serendipity within that because of the algorithm, but it's
right.
not the same.
But that's beautiful because I mean, like for me, like when I read a book, like it might take me an hour to go through 3 pages because my mind has gone. Like I'll be like, oh, there's this concept here. Oh, where? And then you're just kind of like, what if this? And then you just kind of go there, and then you come back like, I got
You're
to come back.
supposed to.
Yeah,
That's how books are supposed to be. They're supposed to knock you out of your pre-existing mind
right.
courses, and then you discover new things in your own mind from the book. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but that's
I conceive of poems while reading other books. While reading
yeah.
other poems, I'll conceive of a completely different poem because a word caught my mind, caught my eye, and it's just kind of like, what could I do with that word? I
Oh,
don't know.
Vok Devi's working, man. She's working, Vok Devi. She's pulling in the words and language, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's the reason we worship the goddess, right?
yeah.
As speech itself. Yeah. So, Amit, this has been fantastic. Thank you. I really
It was
appreciate
great
your
talking to
time.
you.
Yeah. Do
It
you
was
have
great
any,
talking to you.
like, when is your next Mahabharata book coming out?
Again, those are released only in India, and that's going to be coming out later this year. That'll be the third and final volume. I just did the edits on it, so send it out to
It's only
the
released in India. Why not in the U.S.?
because nobody wants to publish in the United States because it's not kicking on Krishna and it's not kicking on the Pandavas.
Oh
It's
man.
true. I mean, they want things that are kind of subversive, but like in my opinion, they don't even know the original story. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
You don't know the original story. Why do you want me to make Krishna the bad guy? Like, what is that all about? You know what I'm saying? Like, but that's just kind of what it's like. And it's an ambitious work. So eventually, I think that if I break through in some other way for some
Yeah.
other work, then I'll be able to go to the publishers and be like, you need to publish this. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah, I mean, there's still ways to get the book, like through like AV books or Goodread if
maybe,
people.
yeah, I have
Yeah,
not looked into that, but yeah,
yeah.
if you're ever in India, you can just pick them all up. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Any last thoughts?
Oh, it was
Before.
great. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for doing having a nice kind of dharmic podcast space. That's wonderful.
No, thank you. I mean, you guys make this possible. I mean, for me, I learned every single time because it's, this is the satsang I think sometimes I didn't get outside of my
Mm.
family growing up, right? Like,
Right, right, right.
I think it was tougher, especially when I got to college and onwards, to meet other people that are actually interested in these kind of things and
Right. And
engaged.
just talking to you, like you and I both know that, we could literally go on for another 3 or 4 hours,
Oh
right?
yeah,
Until dinner time, basically. Like you just keep going.
yeah,
And that love that sense of like, infinitude, right? Like there's an infinitude of the satsang, which is just that it can be infinite.
right. But Amit, this is fantastic. I will put your contact on the show notes in terms of
Yeah.
your websites and Twitter handle and
Yeah.
everything
Great.
else.
Great.
And people, you guys should get his books, God Song for sure,
Yeah.
which I really enjoyed, and follow him on Twitter. And I'll also link up your wife's stuff. So if you
Yeah.
go into so absolutely. Well, thank you,
Great.
Amit.
Thank you.
पुष्पसुगन्धसुमलय समीरे पावन मुनिजन यमुना तीरे पावन मुनिजन यमुना तीरे गायति वनमाली गायति वनमाली मधुरं गायति वन